with that, we're gonna go. I'm excited. I love this. Um, there's so much to talk about, and there's so many places where design affects change, right? The one I think topic that's going to come up next on our agenda, and I'm going to have Sean on our team introduce them, is Farrell Calabrese and Sara, actually. So it's perfect time. Sara, Pink, great to see you guys come up and talk about sustainability and the corporate social responsibility. Like, what do you do to push that? How do you lead that charge?
Good morning, Angela. I'm really excited to be able to moderate this panel. It's not only a topic that I'm really interested in and is really close to my heart, but obviously it's also a great opportunity to talk to Farrell and Sara. So Farrell's right up there on camera. So of course, allow me to introduce her. Farrell Calabrese is a courageous design leader with nearly 17 years of experience. She is deeply passionate about maximizing the potential of people and organizations that surround her. She hopes to leave a legacy for purpose-driven companies by inspiring those she works with to reimagine business, operations, and human capital as we know it, resulting in an inclusive future that allows all of us to thrive socially, ecologically, and economically. Oh, thank you for writing that, Farrell. That's a lot. But also, she is the global sustainability manager and strategic. She's the global sustainability manager and strategic innovations lead at Eastman. So thank you very much for being here, Farrell. Also, I would like to say a fun fact about you that you shared is that when you're not at work, she's adventuring out in the wilderness with her husband and kids and her doodle dog, which is a weird thing I never thought I would be saying today, and enjoying every fun activity that she can do outdoors that she loves. So thank you for being here, Farrell. And I'd also like to bring up Sara Keating. She's a true 21st century Renaissance woman. Sara is one part leader, one part business owner, 2 parts design obsessive, and 3 parts brand builder. That little is a little bit of a reference to some of her fun facts later on, but what she is amazing at is translating consumer insights into iconic brands and stories that drive consumer desire. Her insatiable curiosity drives surprisingly obvious brand experiences and products. Sara helps the world's most recognized companies and brands break through to consumers. She has hired, mentored, and motivated design teams across disciplines and regions, and she has led teams in the trenches on both client and agency sides. Sara's fun fact, as I mentioned, a little bit of a teaser. Besides leading design, Sara has worked as a journalist, architectural glass artist, and here we go, bartender. So a very exciting list of things in your background, Sara. I always love kind of getting that little peek into people's lives outside of design. So thank you both for being here this morning.
Thank you so much for having us.
Oh, please, the pleasure's all mine. But let's get into the conversation at hand. So sustainability and corporate social responsibility, in many ways, are 2 halves of the same coin and can also mean very different things just based on the organization that are in. So why don't we go ahead and just really dig into that? And Sara, why don't we start with you? So in these separate corporate contexts, what does this idea of sustainability and corporate social responsibility mean?
Yeah, so great question. So at Philips, for example, our purpose, of course, is part of it is sustainability, but our purpose is really to improve people's health and well-being by caring for the health of people, also the planet, and that's where sustainability obviously comes in, and our employees. And all 3 are things that we work towards on a day-to-day basis and making sure that we are improving the health of people via patients, our hospital systems, our personal care products, our sustainability with high environmental and social governance standards. We make sure we do that. And then for our employees, we make sure that we have a diverse and inclusive workplace so that we enable the best conversations and the best work for the people who work with us. So it's really spanning those 3 pieces.
And Farrell, same question.
Yeah, so for us, totally similar. I would say that we are a materials innovation company, right? Some of you guys might know Eastman and work with us in the past. But more than that, I like to think of us as a people company as well. And so kind of marrying that corporate social responsibility and that impact through environmental and social action. We serve stakeholders kind of holistically, right? You think about employees, we have 14,500 globally. that we have to take care of. So when we think about that also, that inclusion and diversity, especially that inclusion piece, we can't have diverse global teams without having them truly have a voice and be seen at the table. So we really think that workforce is what's going to enable us to conquer our big goals and our key impact areas. And when you think about what those are and really what the world needs, as we're going to have 10 billion people on Earth, by 2030, that produces a lot more waste. That waste can produce in the manufacturing of all the stuff that we're all creating. That's going to have a climate impact. So our company, from a sustainability standpoint, is really looking to mitigate climate change, mainstream the circular economy, as well as care for society. So think about those societal needs and how do we innovate most for those.
And actually, kind of going on the coattails of that particular answer, Farrell, I'm just curious, how did you, what sequence of events led to you becoming a champion of sustainability in Eastman? How did you get to this point of basically spearheading a lot of these efforts and sort of helping to promote it throughout the corporation?
Yeah, great question. My career zigged and zagged, maybe a little bit building on the last conversation. I have the foundation of my career is probably founded in leadership. I actually started my career as a Division I rowing coach. So maybe that's another fun fact. So I won't go through our whole history, but I've had communications roles. I've had innovation roles. I led the innovation lab for Eastman for a long time after Galen White left. So that's really where my connection with the design community came in. I'm a Northern California girl at heart, living in Florida. So maybe some of those values have been instilled for a long time, but I've always seen how, I guess sustainability for me is kind of the balance and the long-term view of things, right? So just caring for things so that they'll always be here in the future. I'm future-minded. So I think the culmination of my past experiences really led me to the sustainability team at Eastman, and getting to work on some high-impact projects. It's awesome.
And Sarah, I'm also curious, how has your background similarly led in this direction of, either sustainability and corporate responsibility, and how have you taken steps as well?
So, yeah, good question. It's really as when I started and I talked about our brand purpose, right? So that's how I've arrived at this spot, and really embracing the purpose of impacting lives and doing that in a way that obviously helps the company to grow and helps people to grow, and delivers in the best way on things like sustainability. So I think a great example is thinking about current COVID-19 pandemic and thinking about some of the shifts that are happening in healthcare, moving from, if you need care, going into a hospital, right? If you need to go visit a doctor, you're going to a clinic over here, and then you may be going to another clinic to get scanned, and then going into a hospital for a procedure. Well, that's an incredibly carbon intense process, not only from the movement, but if you think about hospitals and hospital systems in themselves are incredibly wasteful, and for good reason, right? We need to be protected and be cleaning and things like that. So the shift to telehealth and remote monitoring helps us to be more sustainable and to help people in a way that better impacts their lives, right? So to move away from that expensive, heavy footprint hospital, which is very waste dependent, to something that fits into a patient's life, right? So for me, the way I've come to this place is, I guess it's about empathy, and it's about caring, and it's about, I'd even say, radical empathy, right? So radical empathy along the chain. So for the company, for the employees, for the patient, and making sure that we are talking and embracing all of that.
I love that, radical empathy. Yes, that deserves a clap or a round of applause. But Sarah, you also kind of really made me think of something, definitely one of the things that have come about through obviously the pandemic, but also a little bit of my personal experience kind of coming into this. My mother is a oncology nurse. And so one of the things she's certainly talking about, to the point you made, Sarah, is how waste driven a lot of hospital work is. And so I think you two can offer some interesting perspectives on this idea of with hospitals having to consume so many materials, producing so much waste, are there choices, are there actions, are there technologies that we can put in place that can help us start to address this? You know, I mean, I'm here in Chicago, and definitely during the pandemic, one thing I constantly see, you know, PPE masks just randomly on the street sometimes. And so as I'm starting to think like more people are using it, it's having a better impact. What are things we need to start doing, and what are things possibly in the pipeline that we can begin to do?
I'll jump in.
Please.
So I think it's really that design is evolving and continuing to evolve beyond the craft of design. We were talking about that a little bit earlier with, I think Bob was talking about, you know, becoming more of a business owner as you increasing your career, or doing different disciplines within design, right? But it's also the systemic design. So thinking about how do we encompass the entire cycle end to end, right? By thinking systemically. So thinking about the service design, thinking about your ergonomically sound product. You know, it's also thinking about the end of life, designing products that can be repaired, which is almost a shift, because we were moving towards more of a disposable society. If I think of, say, our consumer products division, you know, we want people to buy more shavers. So, you know, maybe not that Philips would ever do this, but, you know, building end of life into the product. But instead of doing that, think about how might we extend the life of a product. So for example, in Western Europe, we have a program going for IPLs, which is laser hair removal, right? That you can, instead of buying a device, you can rent the device. And then it's returned and it's properly cleaned and it can go on to another person. Or thinking about, you know, or how might things be repaired? And then of course, also thinking about and designing for the end of life of the product, that you're thinking about how it can be reused in the future at the first point. So it's really thinking about that entire life cycle from a product, and also from a usability standpoint.
Yeah, and I would love to build on that and even take it further from our perspective, right? So we're a materials company, and the same concept, right? But I think the Ellen MacArthur Foundation says about 80% of the world's waste and pollution is designed in, right? So again, not only just thinking about that on the surface, but thinking about how things are made, what materials are you using, thinking about the system of that material, right? Can you lower your footprint? What are your expectations of that footprint? At the beginning of life, are you using recycled content? Are you using biological raw materials? At the end of the life, do you want those materials to compost? Do you want them to be biodegradable? Do you want them to live on in value? So I think, and one of the strongest reasons why I love to stay connected to the design community is there's such an opportunity for the designers to really start to think about this system, like you were saying, Sarah, and really take it forward. And I know the materials and processes classes aren't your favorite, like in college, like I know that isn't one of those expertise areas, but I think as we go into the future, that's going to become a lot more interesting, because the choices that you guys make at the beginning of that design process have a huge impact, right? So if anyone wants to help me get materials and processes to be like way cooler in college, I would welcome your chats after.
Yeah, and I agree with that. It's about the materials, but it's also about our business systems as well.
Absolutely.
So it's certainly about the materials. So to use another example that we're doing here at Philips is think about our monitoring business in the past. So we would sell, you know, to a hospital or hospital system, X number, call it 100 monitors, many more than that actually. And that would have an end of life of maybe 6 or 7 years, right? Well, we're shifting to an as a service model, right? Yeah. So thinking about how might we place in hospitals monitors that are fitting within a larger ecosystem. So as they need repair, they're swapped out for repair as opposed to being thrown out or put into a dungeon somewhere and buying something new. So really thinking about how our businesses can affect even the way the products are designed. Hi, puppy. And and how they're used over time, and how people interact with them, of course, is incredibly important as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with the business model aspect. I think that's another area of, design, that type of thinking and bringing forward those ideas. I mean, industries are ripe for that and are transforming. And I think just building even on what was said earlier, it's solving those big, hairy problems. I think maybe Bob said that, right? And doing that, you know, with a high level of integrity, so like not trying to use it as necessarily a market differentiator, but like, how do you really start to manage sustainable businesses going forward? And that becomes your competitive advantage, right? You're locked in for the future versus at today's node of just, I think sustainability used to be, even 5 years ago, I can differentiate my product in the market because I've got this label on it, or it has, maybe a 1% of materials. So I get to kind of talk about it as natural, but nobody knows what natural means. There's a lot more transparency happening across the board, across all products. And so really thinking about that and thinking holistically, kind of the way that we like to frame it out is kind of beginning of life. What are things made out of? End of life, what's happening at the end of their life? Their footprint, how do we, mitigate that? How do we lower the water we're using, the carbon we're using? And then again, like caring for society, coming back to that piece, our innovations, our creations, they have to serve society of an exponentially growing population. Like 10 billion people on Earth is not like some small impact level. And that is exponentially growing, right? So the impacts of everything we said before, as we serve a growing population, we have got to, I think someone else said that, redesign everything right now. And COVID in 2020, I think, whether it's environmental justice issues, social justice issues, any of the impacts about that globally just show how we're more, linked versus ranked, really, like how can we all come together and really tackle these problems?
And I think that's a really interesting perspective on it, because a lot of it just comes down to like how we look at the impact of what our process has, right? Somewhat relating back, I asked that question about licensing earlier on, and one of the things Bob said was like, architects, it's for like building quality and stuff like that. And in a parallel way, I see that as like, as designers, a lot of these just sort of basic stylistic choices or material choices can have drastic impacts on the environment. As a designer, many of us, like, let's say we have a remote control, client from a TV, and it's like, we're going to make it at ABS, just regular old ABS, throw it out. And it's a throwaway thing. It's a common thing. It's a safe choice, but that can create hundreds of millions of pounds of waste. There's also the greenhouse impacts of producing that. It's a simple choice that has a huge impact later on. And I think it's an interesting discussion that a lot of designers need to have more of. And kind of in that vein, Sara and Farrell, I wonder, what are steps you have taken to integrate those questions, to integrate that far-reaching thought process in the roles that you currently serve in?
Yeah, so certainly within packaging, we talk about this and constantly. So and even like if we think about things like, can we have one common package, which is made out of a highly sustainable material like pulp, right? Wood pulp, and then, but then create it in a modular way, right? So you can put different devices into it, and then maybe it goes into more of a wrapper, which if you're putting it in a retail environment, then you would have a retail kind of environment. But you only do it on a needs basis. So if it's going into Canada, it's got French and English. If it's going into Western Europe, it's got your 8 languages. Or if it's going to be sent from Amazon, it's already in that shipping box, right? So it's I can't think of the acronym right now, but it's easy to open. It doesn't need to have the extra gloss and messaging and attractiveness that one might find is necessary in a retail environment. So thinking about it that way. And then from a product design, also thinking about it in terms of, how do we design things that the obsolescence can be replaced? So is it, you have an electric toothbrush and you're just replacing the one piece, and that extends the life the usable life of the overall product because you're just replacing the brush head. That's a you know, a great example, but how do we take that into less expected areas, right? So obviously into blades and razors, that's obvious, but how do we take that into healthcare? How do we take that into other areas of what we create and what we manufacture? And those are some of the exercises that we tend to go through and think about as we're developing and marketing products.
Yeah, and I would say too, you know, if we were to work with a design group, whether it's in a brand or even outside of a brand, you know, I get the question around like, okay, well, you choose that cheaper plastic, right? Because you also have some boxes that you're limited to and you're kind of designing within those parameters. You know, what's going to make you a leader in the design profession is to get educated on the trade-offs, right? So you can build that story, right? So that education, that knowledge, and then that ability to tell the story of the full impact of your product, right? So you can paint a picture for what an ABS product could look like, and you can do some quick math and scale that over time. Or you could choose this other product, maybe made with a recycled content value of some sort. Maybe it costs more per kg. Great, it's going to scale your product. But at the same time, look at how much waste is being mitigated, kept out of landfills and incineration. Look how much fossil fuel is being left in the ground. Does that actually impact someone's corporate goals? You know, everybody has corporate goals around sustainable materials today, around climate impact. So again, kind of understanding the different nodes of the hierarchy in which you're working, right? The business hierarchy, there's corporate level goals, there's KPIs at business levels and market segment levels. How do you start to factor all of those in and learn that language of business like Bob and Alstar were talking about, and tell that story and position something that you really believe in, you know, and take some ownership in believing in the product you're designing, right? Like kind of have an altruistic view of this thing that you're creating and putting into the world, because that is the power I think design has. You guys have the ability to create new things, and you guys have the ability to redesign the systems and the way we use things. Then you need to go work with the marketing team and get people to, you know, value it at the consumer level, you know, which is a totally different end of the spectrum. But I think more and more our populations are looking for that valued-based, that purpose-based identification with products and brands. So again, if you can pull that story through in your product design, I think you turn heads and you know, your design gets noticed. It might not, you might not choose the more expensive material in that case, but you'll at least have educated the room.
And Eastman, as a slight plug, has some really interesting materials in that space that have different life cycles. I went to SCAD, so Eastman has done plenty of presentations of their cool new materials. So it's cool to see that. But Farrell, you bring up something really interesting about that bottom up and top down process of like how we actually get these things to affect our lives. And if I may just like share two things that came to mind, and I'd like to hear both you and Sara sort of how you break those down. And so for instance, I live in Chicago right now. And when it comes to recycling, Chicago single stream only takes paper, metal, and then recycle code 1 and 2 for plastics. And take a look at a lot of your food products. They're usually 5, sometimes 7, maybe a 6 is thrown in there once in a while. That just goes in the garbage anyway. It's something that seems recyclable, but through various things, like in the case of the municipality of Chicago, completely unrecyclable. Or in some cases, there are packs that need to be recycled in a particular way. Yeah. And then that becomes something where, sure, the company can make a choice, but then there's also like government and municipal choices that affect it, in which case, where does the problem need to be solved? In other cases, this kind of maybe goes a little bit outside of the bounds of what we've been discussing, but in food, for instance, palm oil, it's in tons of things. And if it's not sustainably sourced, it usually comes from massive deforestation. And if you look at a lot of foods you eat, it's all over the place. And so by eating that, you contribute to the idea that more of these plantations need to be made, and therefore having greater impact on the entire process. And of course, globally, the destruction of rainforests. So my thought is, as designers, we're sort of like in the middle of this process, and what really makes the most sense to kind of start targeting as creative professionals? Do we try to go bottom up? Do we try to go top down? Are we limited in our choices? How do we think about this?
Maybe I can start just because I feel like I have more of the infrastructural point of view, perhaps. But, I think that there's different value at different nodes, and you have to be curious enough. First, you have to be educated and knowledgeable, right? So you have to do the work. And hopefully I would hope that this would be like a fun space of exploration for the design community right now. I also think that the term sustainability is so wide and broad that you kind of have to put it into drivers, right? So, who cares about what and why? So if you have a client, learn that client really well, but then take that outside view in and really learn what the full value chain thinks about it, right? What are the regulations? Is it really fragmented like our recycling systems here in America? Europe, it might be a little bit more advanced, right? So the products that you make there could differ from here. Asia and China specifically, they can ramp up things really fast just because of the way their governments are organized. They can also shut things down really fast. So it is this, there's regionalities. Europe, I think, is leading the way, and a lot of multinationals are not necessarily going to produce regionalized products. So you might design to the highest standard, if you will, and maybe that's the way to look at it. And so I think, you have to take all those considerations, but then you also have to understand and or move a consumer audience to value it, right? So how do you do that storytelling? What is the marketing team's part in that? And I was talking with someone, I think it was from Electrolux, and an idea struck me, and I thought it was interesting, and maybe Alistair could chime in on the chat. But when you design for digital, you kind of have all people at the table and you design the product holistically. And I still find outside of that, we still seem to have these silos where, I have this idea or brief or whatever, and we get specs in, and then it kind of goes to this team, and then it goes to this team, and it's still this very linear process. I don't know if that's still very true in design or if that's changing, but what I would say is, how do you get those levels together and start marrying those so that you're finding value and delivering on everyone's kind of key performance indicators or goals across the board? Does that quite answer it?
No, I think that's really there. And I think, Sarah, you can certainly speak to that point of like this linear process of bringing everybody to the table, but I'd also love to hear your thoughts about the previous statement before as well.
It's an interesting question to think about, and I'd say yes, it's changing. So we are attempting to change. So thinking about how do we move to a more agile design workforce. So that's what we're doing at Philips. We're actually doing a huge transformation of our whole design of more than 500 people working in design, and thinking about how do we bring the more multifunctional design spaces. So it isn't that waterfall process going from, okay, the product designer creates something and then they hand it off to the brand identity designer, and then they hand it off to marketing. It's, yes, that still is going to happen to a certain extent, but it's coming together and thinking differently. And the original question that you were talking about, and Farrell, you touched on a few points that I thought were important, because it's not for me as much about the end of life, right? It's about how do we maybe not have the end of life. It's not about, do we make the same things out of different materials, right? It's how do we change the way we use things? And Sean, to your point, is it not eating foods, making a person's commitment to not eat foods with palm oil? Is it eating organic, not only because it's better for our bodies, but guess what? It's better for the environment because we're not putting chemicals into the system. So there's a lot of design that goes beyond the physical product, I think is my point when we're thinking about sustainability and corporate goals and purpose, it's really, we have to think about it differently. And it can't just be about the product design. It's about how do we talk about it? How do we market it so we're not consistently insisting that someone upgrade to a new product, right? So we're actually celebrating the fact that this is a quality product and you can repair it or you can buy supplies for it. So it's not necessarily only about the product design and the materials, but it's about the systems around it. And I think for me, that's something that's very important.
Yeah, and to build on that too, I think it's, like, I don't know, and you could agree or disagree, Sarah, but I feel like 5-10 years ago, corporations decided they had to have a brand purpose, and we came out with these purpose statements, if you will, North Stars. I think now we're catching up to them almost, right? And so we're starting to embody them. I think those were maybe visions and aspirations, so that we could share a vision of the future of where we want to go. And as we've kind of cogged through that, we both come from really big companies, now it's walking the talk at an individual level. So when I talk about like the fact that Eastman has 14,500 employees, I really see us as activators of our corporate brand and purpose, right? And I do a lot internally to help, channel that, train that, implement that across different functions, not just business. I work with HR a lot. I work with our corporate social responsibility team. We've stood up new digital technologies to flatten even employee engagement globally, because typically it kind of sits in our headquarter building, So, that transformation in business, I think, has to happen, but organizations have to teach it on an individual level. And we as humans have to start making choices. And sometimes those choices are harder. Sometimes they're more expensive because they're not habits yet, but there's trade-offs for them. And we just have to know where we are on our own journeys, what our own personal values are, and really align ourselves and the products we use and buy with those. And I think brands will respond also.
Yeah, and it's even about the way we're working. So instead of having 10 people get on a plane and fly to another country, well, we're using Miro to run virtual workshops, or Mural, depending on who you are, right? So it's thinking, how might we work differently? Because that is also a huge impact. And so it's thinking about that, called the brand purpose, and really living it as employees and as a company, and bringing everything that we do to life through that lens.
And so also, just in the last couple of minutes of this talk, I just want to also throw it out to the audience. Please feel free to submit any questions. Angela has tossed one into the ring, and I think it's worth discussing, especially where we are right now in this discussion. But she was talking about, we have IDSA, IXDA, DMI, organizations about sustainability. They're out there, but obviously they're not part of that zeitgeist. There's like the Cradle to Cradle Product Innovation Institute and the Center for Sustainable Design. But it's one of those things where it's not talked about as much academically. I still feel like, especially as designers, when we talk about sustainable choices, it's usually in academic contexts more than it is outside in the real world. So I wonder if Farrell, Sarah, you could kind of speak to that as well.
So I don't know about the specific organizations. We are, say, in Phillips in Design, we do have a team specifically charged to work on the circular economy and sustainability. So there are initiatives like that. However, my fear is, or sometimes the challenge is, that if we say, okay, this organization takes care of it, or that team is responsible for sustainability, then I don't have to worry about it, right? So I think it's something that, when I say sustainability, I do mean, of course, more than that, from the core responsibilities, but I think we all need to own it and live it and breathe it and do it. It's not saying, okay, that company or that team is going to take care of it, because then it won't really happen. So that's my personal POV.
Yeah, and I think of it too. So both corporately and individualistically, that's the word. I think it's the culmination of marginal gains, right? So I think a lot of times we as society, it's that big hairy problem we talked about. There's a lot of them within the context of sustainability, and sometimes it's overwhelming. we know that that shuts you down as a human, and then you have inaction, right? When things get too complex, then our brain kind of freaks out and was like, well, defense mechanism, I'm just not going to do it. Or I'm not going to learn it, or whatever, right? I think that we all have to just start somewhere, right? Because if you do one little action a day, whatever it is, let's just say you bring your reusable water bottle to work and you do that, other people see you doing that, you don't use the cups. Well, over your lifetime, that's a big impact, right? There's a lot of resources that get to stay in the ground and a lot of waste that stays out of landfills and incinerators. You know, so you can think about, start having those types of mindsets even for yourself. And then once it becomes habitual, you know, kind of pick something else. You get to eat fish on Friday instead of meat, or be a casual vegan if you're more advanced, you know. Those are the kinds of things. And then as a corporation, I agree. So I do sit on that corporate sustainability team, but what we're doing is we're transforming ourselves into a center of excellence. And while we have responsibilities at the highest level of the corporation, where we do have to meet the very real goals that we have publicly stated, and we definitely have to meet the environmental targets that are out there globally for us. And we need to maintain the integrity that we have for all of our stakeholders, not just investors, customers, employees, and communities we serve. We work with NGOs. You know, there's a wide body of people that rely on us all the time, all throughout the supply chain. And so we have to maintain that workability there. And as we translate that internally into our organization, it is what, you know, Sara said, it's how do you start to make this a way of being, right? How do you model the way so that when you have new employees join, it already is? How do you maybe, for the older populations that maybe have lived life a certain way, how do you influence them again, just to make some of those small habitual changes? And I think it becomes a culture shift over time, and it takes intention, is maybe the short answer of that.
Agreed.
And so I wonder, like, we've got like a couple minutes left. And so we've talked about a lot of stuff. We've talked about a lot of actions people can take and how we need to maybe think broadly about our work. But one thing I'd like to maybe close with are, what are those walls? What are those gates that really stop these ideas, these mindsets from really becoming sort of bigger, more powerful movements in the world of design, but also just society in general, in some cases? Obviously, you don't have to think that big, society overall. We can keep it a little bit smaller, but what do we see as some of those gates or barriers?
I think it's breaking old habits, right? So old financial models. I think you can talk about personal habits and things like that, but you know, old financial models and the old ways of doing business and the old ways of thinking. So I think Farrell had a really great point where it's taking steps. It's not, you don't have to eat the whole whale at once necessarily. You don't have to change the whole company, but how do we step by step bring in and change the thinking models? And so it's about shift. It's about changing. It's about having that radical empathy, for everyone and for the planet.
Because empathy really is radical. The kids know what I'm talking about.
You just dated yourself, Sean.
I know. Oh, man, everybody knows my age. Oh,
yeah, I think also infrastructure is hard. Change is hard, but change in infrastructure, when you've got millions of dollars of steel and concrete in the ground, and you are trying to think up new models of doing things, that could be expensive capital. You have to get creative on how you solve those problems. And so again, I think, you know, linking, not ranking, it's more about like those new business models, what problem are you trying to solve? And then who's uniquely positioned to solve for that? Finding those people, linking up, and then kind of making those changes as you can. And lobbying for those changes too, because we have to transform some of our industries, and that's going to provide opportunity on one side and it's going to shift opportunities on a different side.
Well, Sara, Farrell, thank you so much for speaking with me today. It's been a lot of fun. It's been really cool listening to your perspectives on this stuff. Hope everybody else has really enjoyed this talk. And again, I want to thank both of you for setting up some time to speak with us today. So
Thank you. My
guys.
pleasure.